Delete Andrew.
Hi, everyone. I'm laughing because my guest and I were joking around a bit right before I hit the record button. But anyway, welcome again to another one of my GaudiumAtSpiz22.com podcasts and YouTube videos. I am joined today by a friend and my tech guru, the guy responsible for all the bells and whistles of my Gaudium at Spiz platform, where I use Webflow to as my basic platform. But I'm a complete technological idiot, what they call a luddite. So I thank Andrew for making everything possible. Andrew lives in Iowa with his wife Cynthia, and but beyond being a tech guru, he's also a theologian, and he is also someone who runs the his own podcast, Luminous Tradition. That's right, right? Isn't it
Yeah, Luminous
Luminous?
Tradition. Yep. Yep.
Luminous Tradition. He is a
Yep.
lay Carmelite, and he is an expert
Nope.
in
Nope.
all
Nope.
things.
No. Broad scapular wear. Not Lake Carmelite. Still considering though. Just want to be clear.
Oh, wow. You're all this time. But
Yeah.
okay, I thought you were, but you're not. But anyway, he knows all things
Discerning.
Carmelite. And in
Discerning.
fact, I've had him on the podcast dealing with the question of Carmelite
Yep.
spirituality before. But that is
Yep.
not what we're going to talk about today, unless we meander into it. I really just, yeah, because there was no huge specific topic I wanted to talk with Andrew about today. We were joking around beforehand. What are we going to talk about today? I just wanted to get Andrew on because Andrew's a great guy, always has great things to say, and I had an opportunity to talk with him, and so we're going to chat. But we are going to begin with something specific. Andrew has mentioned to me that he wanted to talk about uh, conversations he's had with non-believers, and that's
Hmm.
always up my alley. One of my main shticks on the blog is, the unbelief of the believers, and then of course the unbelievers themselves as such, explicitly so. But the
Hmm.
specific question is, he's had conversations. What is it that keeps unbelievers away from the church? And obviously, that's an enormous question. Probably could come at it from 100 different angles, but I'm going to throw that out then to Andrew as our opening salvo here. What is it that keeps unbelievers from the church?
So to use their words, and I am of this opinion, is I think the church as an institution in a lot of ways is irrelevant to them. So what do I mean by that? So if if someone says I want to be healthy, they're going to start exercising, right? And that's going to be a different life they're living. They're going to go to the gym or
Right,
maybe in their
right.
house, and they're going to start, going through the pain and suffering of starting to exercise and getting in the routine, changing their habits, etc. So it's a new life. It's a new quality for, and obviously it's a quality. It's not their whole life, but it's a quality of their life. The church, to the people I've spoken to, and obviously it's anecdotal, I'm not claiming any sort of statistical anything, is that the common factor though is that the church is irrelevant. They're not offering any new life to them. Like, why bother going to mass on Sunday if they're just going to spout the same things I hear in the world? In other words, if the church and the world are the same, there's no distinction. What's the point of the church? You have the world. The world's always going to be better being the world than the church is going to be better being the world. And that's
Yeah,
kind of how they say it. So that's the
yeah.
first thing I'd say.
I mean, that's true. I mean, it always reminded me too when I used to teach at DeSales University, where we'd get to talking about marketing and what the identity of the institution was. And I would always say to them, because we're in Pennsylvania,
Yep.
the problem with DeSales is you try to out Penn State, but
There
Penn
you go.
State is always going to out Penn State DeSales University because it's Penn State. Okay.
Exactly.
And you're not. All
Right.
right. And so why not be something distinctively Catholic?
Right.
Be a small Catholic liberal arts school to the best of your abilities in all of those various categories, and
Hmm.
stop trying to worry about emulating the secular model. Because as we've seen over and over with small Catholic colleges and universities, as soon as they drop the Catholic identity and start to emulate the world, then the world looks at them and says, well, you're no different from everybody else. Why should we attend your institution? So it's a very
Exactly.
similar phenomenon. And it
Yep.
all sort of revolves around the Catholic identity issue, right?
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think, and you know this better than I would, is I think that this question of the church's relationship with the world, I think is obviously the crucial question of Vatican II, with Gaudium et Spes being an obvious example. And and I think that we haven't figured out how to be in the world and not of the world. And that has to do with, because of my philosophy background too. I I always think of excess and defect. I always think that, like, it's very easy, Aristotle, I think it's book 2 of Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle says it's not easy to be good. So it's not easy to get that narrow gate that Christ talks about, to get it right. We're always, like St. Paul says, we're always trying to finish the race. We're always waking up the next day to improve. And I think if you don't see that our life in the faith as that, it's not a set of words. It's not an excess of doctrine to the point that you have this like massive, like, I don't want to call it AI state, but like kind of this like propositional, like
Yeah.
everything is done
Yeah.
in here, this like propositional law versus nothing matters, which is defect, right? So nothing matters. You can do whatever you want. God's mercy will clean it up. If you have these two extremes, you're irrelevant because you've ripped your identity apart. You've kind of torn yourself asunder in a way. I don't know what you think about that, but that's kind of
No,
how
I think that's exactly right. And the thing is it's there's two problems with the more, let's put it this way, the more conservative wing of the church, the more right
Mhm.
wing of the church. I don't know. Sometimes these categories are kind of
I'm
meaningless,
with you on that. I don't really
you
follow, but go
know, and
ahead.
I
Yeah.
hate to use them, and people call me out on using them. Oh, chap, you're always full of these little taxonomies, but you have to resort to them on some kind of shorthand. Okay, so on the one hand, you've got the radical traditionalists or traditionalists, so
Hmm.
called, who just sort of want to double down on a very, very old form of the institutional church. Now, we'll come back to this in a second because there are elements of that I think there's some truth to, but I want to come back to that, especially in the liturgy. But they
Hmm.
just basically say, look, the problem is what we've just identified, that the church is trying to emulate the modern world. So
Right.
let's stop emulating the modern world. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means going back to what we were like in 1890 or 1920 or
Right.
1940. Now they
Right.
deny that that's what they want. The better ones say, no, no, we're not talking about rolling the clock back. We're talking about a modern form of traditionalism. And yet, when
Hmm.
you press them on it, what they mean is, well, let's go back to the syllabus of errors. Let's reject
Right.
religious freedom. I mean, Bishop Athanasius Schneider's new credo, his new catechism that I just reviewed in Catholic World Report, disagrees with Vatican II on religious freedom,
Hmm.
disagrees with Vatican II on, interreligious dialogue and these kinds of things. So, and he's a trad in a sense, in some sense,
Hmm.
right? And so I would say that's not going to attract non-believers back to the church, at least in
Hmm.
my opinion. That's not
No.
a sort of, but then on the other hand, then the other kind of conservative you had are a sort of head in the sand conservatives. Neocons or just regular mainstream conservatives of some kind, I don't know, who
Hmm.
just think that we just need to keep muddling along with current structures and the current way of doing things, that the status quo is pretty okay, and that the problems are exaggerated. So if we just keep limping along
Hmm.
as we're going, then everything is going to be fine, and we will,
Hmm.
and the hemorrhaging of Catholics will eventually stabilize and we'll start getting converts
Right.
again. I think both of those approaches are deeply flawed because they both ignore the fact that the very structures of the church as she presents herself to the world are precisely what the average non-believer out there looks at and says, those things are a turnoff to me. Those things are irrelevant to me. That doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily mean that therefore those things are wrong. Unbelievers can be wrong too, but that is their initial look at the church. Like, all of those structures are irrelevant to me.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, no, I really like what you said there because kind of philosophy's coming out here is so if we take, for example, I'll go back to the exercise analogy. So if you have a person who works out a lot, they become very healthy. You can see it in them, right? They're maybe muscular or toned, or they can run for a long time, whatever. They're athletic, right? Or fit, we'd say. And so, in other words, their life changes their structure. So the structure is changed by the life. And right now with the church, you have competing structures, but I don't know what life we're talking about because I don't think we're talking about the same life.
Right.
I think the to your point, and I think this is a brilliant point of yours. This is a Christological problem. What does it mean to live a life of Christ? Because that's going to determine the structure. That's going to
Yes.
see so, and I think that we don't we have like that's really what this argument boils down to. What does that mean? I don't know what you think about that, but
Well, I agree because
yeah,
the structures have to, in some sense, be transparent
right,
vehicles, media of Christ and Christ's
right,
holiness. That's why it's what I'm on about, eh? Yeah, I'm
yeah,
constantly, talking about the universal cult of holiness and the saints, and people get tired of that.
yeah,
It's like, well, okay, well, we can't all be these holy card saints. That's not what I'm talking about. Look,
right,
the fact is the church is viewed as lacking authenticity, as lacking a certain existential punch to the solar plexus,
Mm-hmm.
that it doesn't grip, it doesn't bite. And
Mm-hmm.
that is a sad commentary
It
on the
is.
fact that the church is supposed to be a medium of Jesus Christ. And
Exactly.
there's nothing more fascinating, interesting, provocative, and world shattering
Yep.
than Jesus the Christ. And yet we've turned him into this formula, like you said, this overabundance of doctrines and so on, and sort of clouded it all over. And
Yep.
so there's got to be some sort of revolution of the heart, as Dorothy Day called it, this
Mm-hmm.
complete revolution within the church of holiness, wherein we breathe fire into those equations, as I
Yes.
like to say. We breathe fire into those equations.
Yes.
Um, so anyway, do you want to add
Yeah,
to that?
no, it makes me think of I may be wrong in this verse. It's in I know it's in Mark 7, but when they're talking about the washing of the hands of the Pharisees. So Mark he has that big like explaining to his readers like why they wash their hands that way. And then he says the Pharisees say, why don't your disciples wash their hands? And Jesus says, the Isaiah spoke beautifully of you. You worship me with your lips, but your hearts are kept far from me. Your worship is in vain because you're teaching the doctrines of men, or teaching the traditions of men, or teaching the doctrines of men, depending on how you translate it. And what struck me with that was, we always talk about conversion and metanoia and all these things. Again, it goes back to that life. What is the life we're called to live by God, and how does that relate to our neighbor in the church? So people say, like
Oh,
you're saying, I can't be a prayer card saint. Well, you're not called to that, probably. You might just be called to the simple prosaic action of not being a jerk to your coworker, or helping
yeah,
your spouse with
yeah,
something. Like, and if it's God's will, that's all he wants you to do, in my opinion. Like, if it's his will and he wants you to do it, that's it. That's because he's God. Like, so
yeah.
I see that, and I also think of how I feel like when you look at that, they speak of me of their lips. There's so much external focus today. Oh, this is the way it means to be Catholic. But what about like that life that people see again when they're like, oh, they're a healthy person. We don't really see that. No one says like, wow, like, I mean, no one's ever called me holy. I need to work on this. But you see what I'm saying? Like, it's like,
Yeah.
I'm so pointing at myself first. It's like, where have I lived that metanoia? Where have I lived that so I don't keep Jesus far from my heart? That's the real
Well,
question.
absolutely. I mean, people often say, "Well, what does this sanctity look like that you're?" Well, it's missional. It's vocation driven,
Yeah.
and for 98% of the human race, once you reach adulthood, your primary vocational mission is going to be marriage and children, and
Yep.
and whatever job you get in order to support that endeavor, and the community that you choose to live in to support that endeavor. Okay, and then as you raise your family in this regard, and you have friends and associates, you get involved in your church and in your local parish, and but it's still with an eye towards your children, your family, including them in this parish life. That is the vocational mission of
Hmm.
98% of people. So what it boils down to, what sanctity, what breathing fire into these equations that would then be attractive to non-believers, what it boils down to for the average Catholic who is listening to this, is to stop compartmentalizing your faith, to
Yeah.
stop treating Mass on Sundays as simply an adjunct to everything else that I do in life, some sort of Jesus sprinkles on the ice cream, Jesus
Yep.
gravy on the potatoes. All right. That, in other words, you live an utterly secular life 98% of the time. And then there's that 1 hour on Sunday morning and maybe coffee hour afterwards, in which, well, this is now I'm doing churchy things. Now,
Right.
we're all guilty. I'm not pointing a finger at anybody. We're all
Yeah, we're all
guilty
going to that. Yep.
of that
Absolutely.
compartmentalization. But
Yep.
this to me is death to the faith. This
Yep.
precisely chokes out the path of sanctity, is this deep compartmentalization that we kind of all engage in. And I think
Hmm.
that's one of the first things that I see. And then there's that 2% of Catholics whose missional vocation is something that we would more readily identify as something churchy,
Right.
right? Kind of
Right.
like maybe what I'm doing with, Gaudium et Spes 20,
Or
what
what
you're
I'm
doing
doing
with
too. Yep.
Luminous
Luminous Church.
tradition and
Yep.
so forth. But then I think that can also be true of an increasing number of lay Catholics. What we need are more and more and more examples of lay Catholics married with children, or even living the single life, who are deeply educated in their faith, who educate themselves somewhat theologically, who are then able to, in this day and age, to go on social media, and discuss their faith openly and
Hmm.
honestly and so forth with others. I think that's where we are right now, is in this great need for uh, more lay saints that breathe fire into the equations of the sacraments that would make those sacraments more attractive to a non-believer in a lot of ways.
I agree. I mean, and I think that one of the things that's been said to me from, non-Catholics I've talked to is they one of so like, and I think this is just a product of our culture. When someone comes down with fire and brimstone, they're just going to turn you off.
Oh
Why?
man,
Because
yes,
there's no consequence. Like people yell crazy things all the time. And if they start saying you're going to hell and then you start pointing fingers at someone, they're going to be like, "Oh, so you don't do anything wrong?" Like, and that's their their number one. Number two is that for better or worse, or I know some other historian will have to look at this, there was like a religious sense, especially in the United States. Like I remember growing up, like I would say at least 70% or more of people went to church. And you said, oh, well, everyone goes to church and everyone's Christian. But now as an adult and having reflected on this is how many of them actually had their heart turned towards Christ? I don't know. I'm not God, but the drop off over the last 30 years tells me that there wasn't any fire there. Because even for me,
yeah, yeah,
I I mean, I always kind of thought religion was kind of silly when I was a kid, and that's putting it lightly,
me
because
too.
when I asked questions, I'd get the answer of either God works in mysterious ways, grace is sprinkles that comes down from God to make you do things that you wouldn't normally do or to help you. And well, like that question doesn't make sense, and they would make you feel dumb for asking the question. So for example, I had a friend of mine who he's not Catholic, and we're talking about our faith, and he said he I will just say that there was abuse in his past, not with the Catholic Church, with a different Christian denomination. And so it obviously that hits he can't even discuss religion with someone without that coming up. So there's a lot of these psychological emotive factors here too that
Yeah,
it's not just theology here. It's like remember, we're all whole human persons with emotions and affectations and desire and memory. There's all these complex things all interacting that make us respond or not to certain things. And so anyway, we were talking and we got to the point about Mary with the Annunciation. And he basically, and I'm just going to say what he said, he thought it was kind of like rape. He thought God came down and just forced himself on Mary. And I had to
yeah,
go through the Greek and show him, no, it's in the middle voice, calm down. There's a freedom there. It's actually the meeting of God and man. God brought him to her level and said,
that's right.
will you be the beachhead through which I bring salvation? And she says, may it come to pass, or fiat voluntas tua, however you want to,
That's
let it
right.
be done. And I think when he saw that, he said, well, why aren't people explaining it that way? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm not a priest or, I'm just explaining to you how I understand it as a scholar and
Yeah,
all these things. And
yeah.
just,
I mean, I always tell my students too. After Mary says, "Fiat voluntas tua,"
yeah,
be it done unto me according to thy word.
yep,
Probably the most important verse in that entire little story, and I always said this to my students, is the one that follows that. It's very short, and it simply says this: "And with that, the angel left her."
yep.
In other words, that's what the angel was waiting for, right?
Exactly. Mission
the
accomplished.
whole point, the whole point to the conversation he was having with this young maiden from Nazareth, all
Exactly.
right, was would you please, could you,
Yep,
and the father would like, and
yep,
are you willing, and well, how can this be since I know not, well, here's how it shall be, and boom, okay, I'll do it, and boom, then
exactly.
the angel leaves. That's
Right.
the point of the story. So when it's explained that way, you're right. Then it becomes more attractive to the non-believer. Now, oftentimes, perhaps the story is explained properly, but a non-believer isn't maybe disposed to hear it or something.
Sure.
Uh,
Yeah.
um, there's something to be said about that. But
But I
nevertheless,
actually, could I interject here real
no,
quick?
go ahead, go right
Yeah,
ahead.
I is one of the things that he said to me was he said, it's because I trust you that I'm able to have this conversation with you. And it's because I trust you that you're able to explain this to me and that I'm able to see what you're saying. Because what he struggled with was how these, when he asked these questions, either to a religious teacher when he's growing up, to his parents, they'd get mad at him if he said what he said to me about
Yeah,
saying it. That's how he understood it. They'd say, "How dare you? That's blasphemy." But he's like, "Look, it's a legitimate question for me because that's what I see." So I guess what I got out of it was I was like, okay, so if I hear a question that's like it for us is patently absurd, right? Like, for example, like how is Jesus really present in the Eucharist, right? I mean, even though we're having a Eucharistic revival here, but like you see what I'm saying? Like this idea that um something that you don't react in a way that's like, how could you be that dumb, or like make them feel dumb because you're reacting in a way that that question is so beyond you. Not that you're doing it intentionally, but it's just you're
Yes.
hearing this provocative view. I don't know how if I'm saying this right. Do
No,
you see what I'm
no,
getting at?
you're saying it exactly right. Here's part of the problem. This is why I went back earlier and said Catholics need to educate themselves. And to this day and age, there's no excuse not to be educated,
Yep.
at least on a very basic level in your faith. There are so many online courses and things that you can take even for free. Get a Word on Fire book, whatever, watch a Bishop Barron sermon. There are
Yeah.
just so many ways you can be better educated in your faith. There's no excuse any longer. And I say that especially of Catholic parents
Yep.
who need to bring their children up in the faith, of Catholic school teachers and not just of religion teachers, and
Yep.
certainly of catechists in the parish who, when asked a question, don't know how to answer it. That's
Yep.
the problem. They don't
Yep.
know how to answer it. So they either resort to very formulaic, answers to these questions that satisfy nobody,
Yep.
or they react in anger, and say, well, you know what, that's a blasphemous question to even ask, the mystery of God
Exactly.
and blah, blah, blah.
Exactly. Right.
I don't want to paint, obviously, these are very, God bless the people that volunteer to be
For sure. Yes,
catechists
I agree. Thank you.
in the
Yeah,
church.
exactly.
This is
Yep.
not a blanket
It's not a
condemnation,
blanket comment.
but
No.
insofar as non-believers do encounter this in the church,
Correct.
therein lies a very particular problem with regard. So I've said this before and I say it again. The universal call to holiness is important. That's the baseline. But for a
Hmm.
modern Catholic living in a country like the United States,
Yep.
part of your call to holiness is to have your mind as informed by the faith as your heart and emotions,
I agree with that.
because you are called to give an account of your faith. And this doesn't mean constantly reading books on Catholic apologetics, the latest from Catholic Answers or whatever, but maybe that is a very basic sort of baseline. And then move on from there to read some decent little theology text. Excuse me, I'm choking a little bit here. My coffee went down the wrong pipe just a little bit, but nevertheless, I think that's key. We have to be educated. Read, for crying out loud. I don't care if it's online or a book. Read something, and this is part of our call to sanctity today, in order to make the faith kind of vibrant again to people.
Well, actually, another fellow Catholic said to me that with Luminous tradition, one of the things he appreciated about it was he knew I had an answer to a question, so he simply pointed someone to something I had podcasted on. So that's another way to solve it too. Like no one's expecting, I know you're not saying this, but no one's expecting anyone to be like the
No,
omniscient. Yeah. Like just
no,
as long as you know something, God will work with that. I think the question is, and you can kind of pull a St. Andrew and say, oh, I can introduce you to this person who knows the answer or this person who can help you. Like
yeah,
I would argue there's grace in that too, because you're assisting them in their journey.
yeah. You have to know some base. I don't want to call anybody out, so I'm not going to mention a name.
Yep.
But I know a person who was a catechist in a parish teaching first communion class, so young kids. And this person was teaching the class about the Pope,
Hmm.
and that he is the vicar of Christ and the successor of St. Peter, and that there's a special chair in Rome in St. Peter's that belonged to Peter, that when the Pope sits on it, he's in Peter's chair and therefore can teach with Peter's authority because he has Peter's chair. So obviously, this person had misunderstood the church's teaching about the chair of St. Peter.
Hmm.
Okay. And the pastor finally replaced this person as a catechist because they made these kinds of mistakes over and over. Now, this is an intelligent, educated person. I want to add that. An
Yep.
intelligent, educated person who
Yep.
should have known better than to
Right.
say something so outrageously dumb. And this person has no chance of listening to this. So those who worried that maybe they do, you know, this person is now quite old, and actually, God bless them, have dementia. But and this person is a very nice person, but nevertheless, geez, come on.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and that's the kind of thing that's just absolutely absurd, that should never take place. Now,
I
that's an
agree.
outrageous example, but you can multiply examples like that over and over. to a less absurd degree, where it's older people asking a catechist or just a fellow, another Catholic or something, hey, what about this? What, like you
Hmm.
said, the Annunciation story. How come that's not God raping Mary?
Exactly. Right.
And you've got to be able to have something to say to people like that. But beyond
Exactly.
the didactic element, I mean, just I think lifestyle is so very, very important. It's something as simple as this. You know, it didn't even dawn on me. I go to an ordinariate parish, and a lot of the people there are very traditional Catholics.
Hmm.
And a lot of those families are very large families. I mean,
Hmm.
5 kids, 7 kids. Oh my goodness. The pastor of the church, Father Eric Bergman, has 10 children.
Wow.
So I've had visitors to the church say, you know, especially when they're looking at all the kids running around during coffee hour in the parish hall afterwards, my God, this church has so many large families. And
Hmm.
they saw that as a good thing.
Exactly.
Okay. Out of the
Exactly.
ordinary. Show me any place else, you know, maybe the local mosque down the street or something. I don't know. But, you know, maybe, and I'm not saying, okay, you're wrong if you're a Catholic and you only have 2 kids or 1 kid. Or I myself only had one child. So I'm
Hmm.
not here to throw stones at anybody. Okay. But still, something as simple as that, being
Yeah.
open to having large families.
Right.
That, boy, as anybody who's ever raised kids knows, that's a that is a sign of sanctity right there.
Hmm.
You know, having
Hmm.
5, 6, 7 children, some of
Yep.
which, you know, I know some Catholic parents, you know, have large families, and some of their children are special needs kids as well.
Yep.
And so,
Yep.
how can I be holy? Well, you're already doing it.
You're already doing it. Exactly.
That's it
It.
right
Yep.
there. And maybe
Yep.
as a church, we need to do a better job of pointing that out to people. Okay.
Oh, I
There's a universal
agree.
call to holiness, and your particular path to holiness is being a parent of children and a good spouse. And we
Hmm.
need to have more examples of what that kind of sanctity looks like.
Yeah, and I think that I think two things stand out to me is that the understanding of examples. So examples begets imitation. So if we put the example of Christ in front of people, people will see that that's a life to be lived, so they can imitate that, and that's where you get obviously the saints. But the saints are even imitators of Christ that give us examples that allow us to see where that fits in for us.
Yeah.
And then it makes me just again think of, I think we did this on a previous podcast with Therese's in the beginning of Story of the Soul with the garden and the little daisies and the roses and how perfection consists in doing God's will and being who he wants you to be. Even if you need to have the diversity and the to have beauty. So God isn't looking for St. Thomas Aquinas clone roses filling his whole garden here. If you're just a little daisy, like that's just as beautiful to God because he's, I'm thinking of John 10. I
Oh,
call
yeah.
my sheep by name. He's saying every single person matters infinitely to him. And I just think that we that's not called out enough either to remind people like, hey, maybe you're not like on a podcast or you're not, and no one knows you, no one seems to care about you. God cares. He does. Trust me. Like, and I
Oh,
think
yeah.
that's not called out enough either.
Oh, yeah. I think of the example of the comparison of an English cottage garden versus a French garden. I used to, in my old house in the Lehigh Valley, when I taught at DeSales, I had an English cottage garden in front of my house. And I
Hmm.
really was into raising flowers. And the difference between an English cottage garden and a French garden is very symmetrical. Everything
Hmm.
is in little raised beds and boxes and squares, and your roses are over here, and your daisies are over there, and the
Hmm.
philodendrons are down there, and so on. Whereas an English cottage garden is wild, baby. It's wild. So you have the larger flowering plants over here, and they're not arranged according to type. They're just willy nilly everywhere. But
Hmm.
then in between the bigger plants, you'll see this little tiny yellow flower poking its
Hmm.
head out, or over here, this little tiny daisy poking its head out.
Yep.
And far from being insignificant, those little tiny interspersed chaotic bits and pieces of small flowers are precisely what makes the English cottage garden beautiful.
Yep.
And
It's a great
not just a
example.
series of symmetrical things. And I think that's the way holiness is in the church. The
Hmm.
smallest little flower
Yep.
is perhaps the best accent piece to the whole thing. Okay.
Exactly. Exactly.
You got the
Yeah.
big flowers growing there, the DRE, the two priests, and the battle axe nun that runs the school, and those are the big flowers, and then you get all the little flowers floating
Yep.
around, and including the children,
Yep.
But that's all lifestyle, and that's important. And you mentioned Eucharistic revival before,
Hmm.
and I think the Eucharistic revival isn't going to go anywhere so long as it's just preaching to the choir and,
Yeah.
let's just have more Eucharistic adoration in the
Yep.
parish, or let's have, okay, fine. Those are all good things. I'm not disparaging them. But in
Yep.
terms of reviving interest in the Eucharist, no, that's just, to me, just kind of preaching to the choir. People already believe in it. So I look at my parish, the
Hmm.
Ordinariate. Father Eric Bergman just put out a promotional video on what Eucharistic revival means in our parish. And
Hmm.
one of the things it means in our parish is, obviously, we have a beautiful Ordinariate liturgy. The Eucharist is
Hmm.
front and center. The Eucharist is the center of our life. And I want to return to that in a second.
Yep.
I'll give you 2 seconds to speak too.
No, this is great. Keep going.
But anyway, but then he says this: the point, one of the points to all of
Hmm.
this is to
Hmm.
transform this neighborhood in which we live. We live in the Ordinary Parish is in a very poor neighborhood of Scranton, the Providence neighborhood, the
Hmm.
poorest neighborhood in all of northeastern PA. And
Oh.
his point is, okay, we're going to move out from the Eucharist. Okay, so now we have a crisis pregnancy center right across the street from our parish, run by
Mm.
parishioners. Right across the street, we have the ministry of Marcus Daly and his wife Kelly, who run this thing called Marian Caskets, and he makes very simple pine caskets and pine crosses. And this is part of a
Hmm.
ministry for the church as well. We have a Divine Mercy ministry that's run by a guy named Jerry Bauman, and a Divine Mercy Farm run by Matt and Jess Nickel in our parish. And we have the Dorothy Day Farm that we run associated with our parish. Soon there's going to be an emergency shelter opened by our parish. You see the point? You see the drift?
Yep.
So flows out from the Eucharist into the neighborhood in corporal and spiritual works of mercy.
Yep. Yep.
Today, as we speak, there's a funeral going on in my parish for a man who was, I think, around 60 years old. Just a very humble guy. He had some sort of skin disease where something like neurofibromatosis, that
Okay.
disease, you get all
Okay.
these bumps all over your face and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
And his family was kind of fallen away family, Catholic family. But they saw the way in which the parish rallied around this guy. And they were so moved by it that they started attending the Eucharist, and the Eucharistic liturgy itself and its beauty captured them. Well, sadly, this fellow's name is Timothy Carr. He passed away last week. His funeral is this morning. He died of cancer, which was a complication of his disease.
Hmm.
Uh, and I could not make it because I had a medical appointment of my own. But my wife informs me that the church was just overflowing
Yep.
with people. Okay. And that had to impress this family even further. Look how they loved him.
Yep.
And that's the Eucharistic revival right there.
Yep. Yep. No, I agree. Well, I think that last line, look how they loved him. I think if people see how you love others and they see
Yes.
that that's the love, that's charity, agape, that's actual, they'll say, where does that life come from? And you point at the Eucharist and you point at tradition, you point at scriptures, and exactly. And you say,
Yeah.
and that's where it comes from. Do you want that life? And if
Yeah.
they say yes, then you say, come, and I think it's just we over like I guess what I'm trying to say is we could get concerned all about the meaning of words, but meaning has to have some object of reference. It has to be that, like, it has to be Christ. That's our object of reference. That's the meaning of all things that everything builds on. And I think that we're struggling to capture that, and that's what's causing this rending. That's what's causing this split. Um,
Yeah,
you know,
I agree. And it helps to stop that rending, to stop that
yes.
split, in order for the Eucharist to truly engender in a massive way this outflowing of charity in the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. The liturgy has to be profound,
Yep.
and it has to be beautiful,
Yep.
and it has to communicate transcendence and the sacred.
Yep.
I said at the beginning, that I'm critical of traditionalists, but they've got one thing right. And this is why I can at times be both trad critical, but also trad sympathetic. And
Hmm.
what they have right is that the liturgy has become diminished in the
Hmm.
modern church.
Hmm.
And I'm not here to
Hmm.
throw all kinds of aspersions at the Novus Ordo and so forth. But the fact is, in most of our parishes in the United States, the Mass is performed in an utterly banal way
Yep.
that does not communicate transcendence and the sacred the way that the old liturgy can,
Hmm.
and often does.
Hmm.
And I feel that way about the ordinary liturgy. That's why my wife and I first attended this parish. The
Yep.
liturgy, gorgeous. It is transcendent. It is sacred, and it
Hmm.
just exudes the sacred. Do
Hmm.
our Eucharistic liturgies exude the sacred in a specifically Christological way that then provokes us
Right.
to charity?
Exactly. And I think it not only provokes us, it's you're there entering into the Trinitarian of life of God through Christ with the community as one through the priest and the presence of the Eucharist. Like there's a like we don't think about that. We often think of ourselves as, oh, I need to be holy, or I need to be, well, you're in a community, a mystical body of Christ that, look, no one's perfect, but like where you're being called is like, in a way, it's relative in the sense that it's for others. It's going, that to your point, provoking that charity. It's going out to others. It's,
Yeah.
I remember once I was at dinner, this is years ago. We took a friend of ours to dinner, and it was the first time we like really hung out, like outside of like where we knew each other. And I was sitting there with my wife, and he's watching us talk with each other. And Cynthia and I are just going back and forth and talking. And he goes, can I just pause you for a second? I go, what? And he goes, I've never seen two people talk like that to each other. And we're sitting there like, this is just, but then I realized that our world is so nihilistic, so attacking, so judgmental, so like, and judgmental,
Yeah.
and I mean in like the worst way, like, so that all of a sudden when he saw someone who was genuinely trying out of, obviously charity with my spouse, to listen and just basic stuff, like listen to her, what was she saying? Okay. And I respond, she responds, and there's this back and forth. He thought it was like something from another world. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's the simplest thing. We're just sitting at dinner having that. And to this day, that has had a profound effect on him. To this day. And then that also builds trust. Why does it build trust? The same person has confidentially said to me, I'm not Catholic, but if you ever, like, wherever I'm in the area, if you brought me to church, and this is how he said it, he said, I'm willing to trust you wherever you take me because I know I'm not going to get hurt because you care about me. Think about that for a second.
Yeah.
Like, that is such a loaded statement that I think we as Catholics don't think about these things because, again, we generally, especially, we're involved, as you said, these ecclesiastical debates, the sprinkles, like the cake is rotting, and we need to stick, with Christ said, without me, you could do nothing. He's the vine, we're the branches. Like, we need to get this Christological life back within ourselves, pointing at myself again, and with everyone else. And then we can, move back out, because that's what's going to call people in. Only he can call people in through us. Like, we of ourselves can do nothing. And does that make sense? Like, am I making any sense?
It
Like,
makes perfect sense. And
yeah,
it just, it cuts to the core of why I'm somewhat critical. I'm not just critical of the traditions. I'm critical of very progressive Catholics as
right.
well, and to a
Yes.
certain extent of to the extent that he goes along with progressives, Pope Francis, although he's a complex figure. But anyway, uh, because what what the non-believer turns to the church for is precisely a counterweight to the
Right.
culture, a
Exactly.
counter witness to the culture, a prophetic witness against the culture. And that's, I mean, I'm not saying against everything modern. I mean, if, like you began with, if the church is simply emulating the world, a worldly person will find nothing of interest in the church.
Right.
They will seek out the church when their own life has reached a crisis, a
Hmm.
moment of decision. I'm going to take this path or this path. I
Hmm.
know my path right now is more materialistic, nihilistic, not oriented towards spiritual things,
Hmm.
but I want my life to be oriented towards spiritual things. Where
Hmm.
do I find spiritual things? Who can
Exactly.
feed me spiritual things? Oh, I know. I'll go down to this Catholic church. And then the first sermon I hear is, I'm okay, you're okay. It's nice to be nice to the nice, and
Exactly.
you're just fine where you are, and don't
Exactly.
worry about anything. God loves you where you are. And the person said, well, that's all well and good, but I got that at my local Rotary Club. I don't
Exactly.
I don't need that from you. What I want to know is, why should I bother attending your church? What is special
Exactly.
about your sacraments?
Exactly.
What are they giving me in a sense? And
Yep.
what I'm seeking is something damn different. So
Exactly.
I'm saying to Catholics out there, this is why I'm critical of progressive Catholics. And they don't understand sometimes. It's because they undercut the call to holiness. They
Hmm.
undercut the path to sanctity and salvation. And that's what people are looking for out of the church. They're
Yep.
not looking for comfort and a pat on the back, although
Hmm.
some people who are crushed, demoralized, broken,
Absolutely.
damaged people, you begin with the pat on the back. I'm
Hmm.
not talking about those. I'm talking about your average secularized, materialistic person who wants something more out of life.
Hmm.
Okay? And they come to church and they don't get it. And they need to see something sacred in the liturgy as well.
I agree. And I was thinking when you're talking there, I was just thinking about when, Christ says, whoever wants to be my disciple, take up his cross and follow me daily. Um, I, we often think of the cross as like, oh, well, I have this real jerk at work that I have to deal with, and like I have to,
Yeah.
deal with this person. It's always externalized in a sense. Whereas I feel like the first question is the cross that we're carrying is how are we crosses to others? What is our prime, like I'll point at myself, what is my primary flaw that's a cross to those around me so that in carrying it, that I'm going to be falling, but I'm begging God through penance. This is where penance and mortification, I would argue, come in, is like trying to work on that to kill that in me so that I can be more united to Christ for the sake of others. And I think like if you look at mortification and penance as simply kind of like, a materialist, like, oh, I'm just going to impose tons of things on it, or you look at it, only the people in the beginning of the spiritual life need mortifications and penance. Like, well, then why did St. Paul says he's struggling to finish the race? And this guy's like
Yeah.
impossible to the Gentiles. I think he
Jeez.
was still dealing with mortification and penance. So yeah, it's
I'm
like,
stuck in that phase. I've been stuck in that phase for 65 years, it seems
yep,
like.
yep,
But I want to come back to the liturgy too, because, and I agree
yep,
with everything you just said there about the need for purgation and penance and so forth. It's not white knuckled asceticism and white knuckled penance.
exactly.
It's the natural response that one has when one approaches the holy.
Right.
Moses taking off his shoes and so on, feeling like, okay, I'm coming into the presence of something sacred, and I'm not quite ready to be in the presence of something that sacred. Now,
Hmm.
there's a fine line. The sacred, to borrow the phrase from Rudolf Otto, is both fascinans et tremendum. It should
Hmm.
fascinate and therefore attract us to it,
Hmm.
and not put into us such a fear and loathing about ourselves that we feel judged by this
Hmm.
sacred, and how it's a great idea. Of course, it's a great idea. You know, it's my idea. You know, okay, it fascinates and attracts, but also, in Rudolf Alda's phrase, tremendum, from which we get the word tremble,
Yeah.
tremendous,
Hmm.
that it creates in us an internal, not servile fear or sheer terror,
Fear of the Lord. Yep. Yep.
but that sense of goosebumps rising on your arms and the hair rising up on the back of your neck as
Hmm.
you approach something so out of your frame of reference that
Yep.
it's going to burst your wineskins. It's going to bust
Yep.
you wide open, but in
Yep.
a great way, in a way
Yep.
that's finally going to allow you to blossom.
Yep.
Does our sacred liturgy
I like that.
impart that? So that when, I mean, you go into an Eastern Orthodox church and you're immediately aware,
Yep.
oh, I'm in this.
Yep.
And you go into an old fashioned, like, Catholic church with
Hmm.
beautiful stained glass and Gothic architecture and
Hmm.
statues and all that. And you realize, and votive candles, and you
Hmm.
realize, oh, a hush comes over you. And you realize, I'm in the presence of something sacred. You walk into some of these modern churches in the round that look like Boy Scout meeting camps, And it's like, okay, I'm going to sit here and have a coffee while I ponder the day's events, but it doesn't instill in you fascinam et tremendum. And then the
Hmm.
liturgy comes up and it doesn't either. There has to be that sense of I'm entering into heaven or the antechamber of heaven.
Hmm.
That's beauty. I mean, that's Bishop Barron. We have to lead with that kind of beauty, but a
Hmm.
sanctified beauty.
Yes, I think qualifying with the sanctified beauty, because otherwise, well, two things come to mind. Is first, it could devolve into simply aesthetics. So now you're back to the
Right.
externals. You don't want that. So I think I like that qualification. And then the second thing that came up when in my mind while you were talking was is I sit there and I'm like, this all sounds great. Like I'm all with you on everything you said, but how do we do that? And I'm not flipping the script here on you. I'm asking this almost rhetorically. It's like
Yeah.
I feel like it's there's a lot of layers here where like for example, one layer can so I'm thinking, for example, the like maybe you have a priest in your parish who like would not be on board with what we just said or think it's just, oh, it's too frilly and that's all
Oh,
nonsense. We don't
yeah.
need to that. But then on the other hand, you could have the opposite situation where there's lay people who they don't want that because they want their jam band. And I'm not, I
Oh,
mean, like
yeah.
I'm talking like full on jam band. And and that's because that's how they've been doing it for however many years, and that's how this parish does, that type of thing. So I think that type of institutional bureaucratic like sludge, to put a better word, I don't know how, probably a bad metaphor, but like a block obstacle, like I think that's what frustrates people too. And I don't know how to deal. I have no idea how to
Well,
deal
it
with it.
frustrates all of us. It
Yes.
frustrates those involved in liturgical reform. It
Right.
frustrates priests.
Right.
It frustrates a lot of people. Here's what's lacking in the church, and I'm just going to be blunt:
Yep.
leadership.
Right.
It has to come from the bishops. And
Yep.
so when they said, we're going to have a Eucharistic revival, you know what I thought to myself? Yeah, right. Right. Meanwhile, three
Yeah.
fourths of the American
Right.
Catholic bishops are okay with Father Skippy Toes up there
Yep.
blessing the crowd with his guitar, as we saw in Chicago. All right, under Cardinal Supich, the priest who ended, it blessed the congregation at the end, raising his guitar.
Yep.
And dear Lord Jesus, we rock as you roll, and I bless you, blah, blah, blah. I mean, are you kidding me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
That priest was not disciplined by the diocese is insane. And
Yeah.
because what it communicates is that Cardinal Supich doesn't care. He doesn't
Hmm.
care about the state of the liturgy in his. And I don't want to just pick on Cardinal Supich. It's across the board. You
Yep.
and I probably both know priests. I certainly get emails from them
Yep.
all the time. A
Yep.
priest who says, I wanted to start doing Mass ad orientem. I wanted to institute altar rails and communion on the tongue
Hmm.
while kneeling. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only way that the sacred can be expressed. I'm saying these are ways that priests were trying to reinstitute some elements of a sense of this is not a Boy Scout fellowship meal we're having.
Right.
This
Exactly.
is something sacred. And this was their way of doing it, only to
Hmm.
have their bishop say, no, you can't.
Right.
You can't. We have
Yep.
to have uniformity in the diocese, and it has to be versus populum. Okay, fine. But you can't do the altar rails. Oh, and by the way, you have complaints coming into my office all the time about your new Gregorian chant choir. That's
Yep.
got to go too,
Yep.
because the parishioners don't want that. All right.
Yep.
So what you need in that case is like a Bishop Conley from Lincoln, Nebraska, my buddy, my friend, who I went to seminary with, who does Mass ad orientem himself. All right. And therefore communicates to his fellow priests, yeah, you know what? And you can too. And maybe you should. They don't
Right.
all,
Right.
maybe most of them don't. But that's the kind of leadership that we need out of our
Yep.
bishops. And we're
Hmm.
just not getting. So everything that you and I have said here today, we live in a church of priests, bishops, and so on. And we can complain all we want
Hmm.
about that fact. We need more late, but it has to come in the Catholic Church. Change comes from both below and from above.
Right.
It has to have both elements. Uh,
Yes, yes, and
go
it's
ahead.
they're correlative, and like, and to your point is, if the priest goes and does things, and then the bishop gets complaints from the lay people, the priest is going to back down because now the bishop's involved, and you get the chancellor, and then everyone gets all like hands start waving, and oh my gosh, and it's just, I feel like it, and it's frustrating because like to kind of tie it to our earlier point about how people come into the church, I am honest with people about the interfighting because I'm like, look, if they decide to join the church and they think it's going to be, because especially coming in, they think, oh, people are going to be holy, they're going to be great, and they come in and see what we deal with all the time, what we're just
Yeah.
talking about and all this, they're going to be in shock. So I kind of have to prep them. And I even, I'll even show them some of the videos from both sides. I'll say, here's what they say. And not, and what's it called? Steelman, their arguments say, this is what they believe. This is why they say it. This is, but the thing is like, that's just an additional obstacle again to even bringing people in. So by creating obstacles within, we're creating obstacles for those without, because again, to your point, leadership, no one
Yeah.
wants to step up and lead. They want to
And
just,
yeah. And with regard to lay people complaining about things,
yeah,
um, okay, in any given parish, on any given weekend, you have probably at least three masses, a vigil mass on Saturday and two on Sunday, sometimes four
yep,
masses.
yep,
All right. Well, okay. Leave the other three masses, just three of the masses or two of the masses exactly as they've always been, so that
yep,
the St. Louis Jesuit crowd gets their gentle woman and their Yahweh
yep,
you are near to
yep,
guitar to their heart's content. Okay.
yeah,
Gentle woman. Yeah, yeah. We sang that at church last week. God help us. All right. She was anything but a gentle woman, as the song implies.
yeah,
But anyway, I digress. Then have one mass be a more solemn
hmm,
Gregorian chant, bells and whistles and incense and
right,
and all that kind of an odd orientum and so forth. So
yep,
and then let the chips fall where they may. Let's see
hmm,
which mass becomes more, in a sense, popular, which
hmm,
mass becomes more well attended,
hmm,
which mass sees those envelopes filling up. The
hmm,
all
right,
important
exactly, right,
envelopes filling up.
yeah, the
Because after
envelopes,
all, this is what bishops often fear. The
yes,
envelopes flying because that's what they get in their email box, right? Look,
yep,
I've given $10,000 to this church in the past 5 years, and you're not going to see another nickel if Father Jim John over there keeps on with what he's doing. And okay, well, that's going to get your attention because
exactly,
church needs a new
exactly.
roof after all. So yeah,
Well, it's funny. I'm laughing because that's exactly how it is, and it's so funny that like, yes, that like, I guess what I got thinking about, this is a, I'm not, this stays on this topic, is like the other question about this Christological life and what we're dealing with the liturgy is the question of what is the church. So let me give you an example. I think this is during the Second Vatican Council. Uh, was his name Wozneski? He was the cardinal at the time. Stefan was Wozneski. I don't want to pronounce his name properly.
now you've got me screwed up.
Yeah.
Um, from you mean from Poland?
Yes, from Poland. Yes, thank you.
Bashinsky.
Bashinsky, thank
Yes.
you. So he got up and he says, look, one of the things that is interesting is we're talking about the church in the sense of clerics, parishes, in like kind of these like institutional things. He goes, what about like in Poland where the communists have wiped all that out? Like we're just like a people. How do we deal with that question? And I think that with the decline of these institutions, the closing, that's an important part of that question that I think ties into this question about liturgy and a Christological life and the qualified sanctity of sanctified beauty. Like how, like, and I'm kind of flipping the script on you. I apologize. It's your podcast.
No,
But
but this is a great point. Go on.
yes. So like how, I guess my point is we need to answer the question about what is the church? Like kind of like, it's
Yes.
not just so go ahead.
No. I'm sorry. I keep interrupting. I'm just agreeing with you out
Oh,
loud. So
okay. Yeah. No,
you interpret that as me interrupting. No, this is me like,
oh,
yeah, amen, brother. You preach it, boy.
okay. I didn't know. I didn't want to. So yeah, no, I just feel like, and to me, like if you take Poland as the example, it's obviously not those things. Again, those things follow from something else. So what is that something else? And now you could say the mystical body of Christ. Okay, well, what is that? What are our teachings on that? And like, how does that work? And like, what, because people are going to ask that question because as these parishes shut down, if the trajectory stays the same, then people, you're going to have people who all of a sudden they're going to be like, well, why did I go to mass every Sunday? I maybe listened to a couple of sermons on YouTube. Like, why is this gone? And that shock for them, are they going to stay? Are they going to go? Again, it just speaks to this.
Well, we're shifting gears a little bit in the sense that we began by talking about how can the church be more attractive to unbelievers, to secularized people who are maybe
Mhm.
outside of the church. And that's why I emphasized beautiful liturgy, educated Catholics being, able to answer. But now we're talking a little bit about how do we keep Catholics who are in the fold in the fold.
Well, and also for the non-believers, just interject real quick. the non-believers say, well, if the institution is so true, why is it shutting down? Why is it going to pot? So I also think it ties in there, because then when I've explained to them the little that I know about the mystical body of Christ, and we're all connected to Christ as the head through living the life of Christ in communion with the church, like they kind of got that. They're like, okay, so then for them, what was actually, now I think about it, what was provocative to them about the mystical body of Christ was it wasn't an institution. It was something organic. So then all of a sudden they're like, okay, now I'm listening. So you're saying that the Catholic Church has a doctrine about this mystical body of Christ that begets this institution, in the sense that they use these materials to bring down through the ordinary forms the grace of Christ. And so I
Yes.
think that's
And
another
this is
thing that,
key too. If you're a priest and you're in a parish and you can't introduce high liturgy of bells and smells, it is possible to have very low liturgy uh, that is extremely effective
yep,
and profoundly. In fact, some of the masses I've attended in my life that brought tears to my eyes and changed my life in important ways were some of the lowest masses
me too.
imaginable in
Yep,
somebody's living room or in a
yep,
makeshift office at a retreat or something like that. And there was no
yep,
music, there was
yep,
no incense, no bells and smells, and yet it was quiet, it was simple, it
yep,
was direct. And the difference is in those settings, there was faith.
yep. I
There's
agree
no
with that 100%.
that the best liturgies are liturgies that are expressions of an evangelical commitment to Jesus Christ as our Lord.
Yep.
And I'll give two examples of this just to show that I'm not simply all about high liturgy. High liturgy to me is important. It's
Hmm.
important as an enticement through beauty to a certain kind of non-believer. But even that, like you said, is just empty ritualism if there's no faith underneath of it.
Right.
I attended the Newman Center at the University of Nebraska when I was a freshman at the University of Nebraska in 1978.
Hmm.
The Newman Center there was filled to the gills with young people. It was just busting its seams, so much so they had finally had to build a new church, and it's a gorgeous, new, beautiful church if you've ever been there. But it still remains to this day the greatest faith community that I've ever been involved in. And yet the
Hmm.
liturgy there was all guitar. It was typical late 70s. I mean, there was nothing, there were
Hmm.
no liturgical abuses. I want to be straight about that. The priest was very orthodox, and that's key. And I'll get
Hmm.
back to that in a second. All right. But it was all guitar music. It was all folk music. It was all St. Louis Jesuits and
Yep.
tambourines and
Yep.
guitars. And yet you could cut the faith in that room with a knife. It was so thick. And it
Hmm.
remains to this day the greatest experience of intentional Catholicism. So what was it? It was a parish, a Newman Center, that
Hmm.
was evangelical in a way that addressed the crisis moment of a certain age group, a certain demographic, 18 to
Hmm.
22-year-old, highly secularized little college kids,
Hmm.
okay, who were seeking something spiritual. Enter this vibrant priest,
Yep.
okay, who then catalyzed around himself this is why Lincoln to this day has all these vocations coming out of the woodwork, because all kinds of young, and I went to the seminary because of this and so on. It was vibrant. So the liturgy was a guitar mass liturgy, and yet there it was. And the
Yep.
reason why it fed us was because the faith was already there. Segue then, when I was at Fordham getting my doctorate, I once blogged about this. A friend of mine said, I want you to come to my church. All right. My friend was Baptist, we went to this little storefront church of African Americans mainly, but some Latinos, and it was like an AME church, and the worship was you know guitars, electric guitars, and drums, and
Hmm.
people getting slain in the spirit, very Pentecostal, dancing around in the aisles, uh, arms raised in the air, all this kind of stuff. It was wild, baby. It was wild. All right. And I was there, a pinched up little turd that I was, thinking, well, I don't know about this. And yet I was like touched to my core by this thing. And towards the end of it, this great big huge woman came bounding down the aisle. I was standing in the back like some sheepish little guy. And man, she grabbed me and gave me this big hug and smothered me. All right. And dragged me up front and said, we're going to pray for this guy. And then put me down. They all come up, put hands on my head. And then we had cookies and punch and stuff afterwards. It remains to this day one of the greatest encounters I had with
Hmm.
real Christian people,
Yep.
worshiping a form that I thought, boy, this is bizarro world. It's
Mm-hmm.
not my cup of tea. It still isn't my cup of tea. But
Mm-hmm.
that's the point, though. I was still
Mm-hmm.
touched by it to my core because there was faith there. There was
Right.
faith there. That's the fire in the equation. And that's
Exactly.
what I'm on about with regard to sanctity. It is
Yep.
lived out faith. Live it however. I don't care. I can't tell you how to do it. All right. Live your faith, but have faith.
Yep.
And if the
Yep.
parish is vibrant, and that's why I love the ordinariate, the liturgy there is gorgeous. That wouldn't have kept me there. What
Mm-hmm.
kept me there was the fire in the community.
Yep. Yep. No, I think you're dead on. And that what that actually shows is that there's a correlation. So you have the faith begets certain types of expressions. So you'll have, like in your case, the Mass or the Lady prayed on you, or then maybe you have a
Yeah.
beautiful Latin Mass or Eastern Orthodox, or I'm
Yeah.
thinking Greek Melkite I've been to. Like you get these
Yeah.
gorgeous, but then also that expresses, so the faith expresses it, and then the expression speaks back to the faith for those who see it, like you did. Well, this expression doesn't, like, because you said like this isn't what how I express it, but all of a sudden their faith came through that expression and spoke to you, and that's what got you, you know what I'm saying, like so
Yeah.
I think that's you're exactly right. I think it's, and we just need to remember
What I'm
that.
also saying is that one of the reasons why most Novus Ordo liturgies in most parishes seem so disattached, unattached
Yep.
to the real lives of the people there
Yep.
is because, for whatever reason, I'm not going to blame the lay people. I'm not going to blame the priests. I'm not going to blame the
Exactly.
bishops. It's a
Yep.
collective failure,
Yep.
a collective failure.
No, I
The
completely agree.
faith life in that parish is lacking.
I
And
agree
for
with that.
whatever
Yep.
reason, it hasn't been lit on fire.
Yep.
And therefore, the liturgy itself comes to be this pro forma thing that I do on Sunday mornings to fulfill an obligation. Because okay, let's give it its due. People are at least doing that. They're realizing
Right.
I need God in my life. I
Mm-hmm.
want God in my children's lives. I'm going to bring them to church.
Mm-hmm.
But it's on a very minimalist sort of plate. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think too, the other struggle people have is like, and I see this from people my age, is they're faithful Catholics, they'll go to church on Sunday, but one of their frustrations, and I would argue this would apply as well to the non-believers too, is they they expect, for example, at the homily that they're going to learn something about the gospel. That's their one time that week that they're going to hear from the priest who they believe is
Right.
the authority, who's going to tell them something that's going to feed their faith for the week. So, well, obviously it speaks to the parts of the homily, but the thing is, to your point, if the community lacks faith, then that homily is going to be the what you said earlier, which I'll summarize as Jesus loves you, be good, see you next week. And so
Yeah.
then I think, so if they hear that all the time, they're going to feel like, well, what about my faith? They'll start to struggle with it. And until, I had some friends who were in the church who were struggling with their faith until, they got introduced to some saints, like Augustine is a good example of this, where all of a sudden
Mhm.
they're like, wow, he had the same questions I did. He dealt with similar problems that I do. And then now that faith gets reignited because they're like, oh, I don't have to doubt this anymore. I can live this because he lived it, and or Christ dealt with this, and that getting that faith on fire and that constant feeding
Yeah.
of that. Yeah, I
And
agree.
you know what? That is so true, Andrew. Everything you just said is so true. And it feeds on itself.
Yep.
Um, and just as a sign, I'm not being judgmental here. Oh, those horrible parishes that are out there. If only they were as good as my parish. No, because the deal is this. That's why I go to this parish. Because when
Yeah.
I go to a standard suburban sort of bourgeois American parish,
Hmm.
I I I'm like a chameleon. I
Me too.
become just like it. All of a
Yep.
sudden, I'm sitting there in the back of
Yep.
church looking at my watch, wondering what I'm going to get at the
It's
diner
such a
for
struggle.
breakfast
Yeah.
afterwards, and saying, okay. And I'm suddenly am now, okay, this is just there you go, mass, there
Yep.
you go. You done it.
Yep.
Okay, bye bye.
Yep.
And I'm annoyed if the recessional hymn goes longer than two verses because I want to get the hell out of there, you know. Yeah, guilty as charged. So
Charged. Exactly.
the point is there's something structural going on here in the ethos of our parishes.
Hmm.
I think, in other words, you scratch the surface of an average parish, there's faith there to be tapped into.
I
There
agree.
is there is sanctity and greatness there
Yep.
just waiting to be tapped into. And I think a lot of priests know it too. But there's some kind, and I don't know the answer to this, Andrew. I don't. Maybe some listeners do. What the magic formula is. Maybe there isn't a magic formula.
Well, I actually think one thing that I've realized is I think they're afraid of the cost. To do a good thing has a cost.
Yeah.
And I think they're afraid that if they once you scratch that surface, again, it's when you either follow Christ or you don't ultimately, right? I know we're all struggling with about it. We'll take it ultimately. When you scratch that surface and you start moving towards Christ, you're going to be moving away from something else. This boring whatever, because that's not Christ, because we've kind of established that. So as you move along that, we'll call it this spectrum, right? Like colors. You're moving along the color spectrum towards Christ. You're moving away from that, and you're going to lose those people who don't want to move with you. And they don't,
Yeah.
I think they don't want the conflict. I think they're afraid that any conflict is bad, but then why are we struggling to be good? Because that's conflict with ourselves. Like I just find that that's
That's
the
right.
trap
That's why
they
you're
fall
losing
into.
young people because there's nothing
Yep.
challenging about it. There's not. We're
Yep.
right back to the beginning then uh,
Exactly.
of what I call status quo Catholicism.
Yep.
Because we're afraid of losing people, we're not
Yep.
going to call them up higher. We're not going to tap into that reservoir of sanctified greatness that is just waiting to be tapped into. We're
Hmm.
not going to do that because we're afraid that only about 35% of the parish wants to be so tapped. Right?
Right.
The other
Exactly.
65% are going to start to trickle out the door. Well,
Yep.
newsflash, they're already trickling out the
Trickling
door.
out the door. Exactly.
And the point
Exactly.
is that those who remain are there because they want to be there.
Yep.
And they want to, you see this all the time. All right. Suddenly a vibrant priest comes into the parish and the parish lights up and is on
Hmm.
fire. And parishioners are so excited. Oh my God, we've got Father blah, blah, blah. And he's
Hmm.
doing this and he's doing that. And I don't care what the liturgy is or whatever. There, people are, and then all of a sudden, 3 years later, Father is being switched to running 5 parishes in central PA,
Yeah.
and you're now getting the 80-year-old retired priest as your interim pastor, and then
Exactly. Yep.
now you got to love bishops. That's their choices,
Yep.
right? Okay. As
Exactly.
vocations diminish, this is what they're left with. And
Yep.
so once again, I don't know what the magic formula is, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and it's tragic to me because I often think, again, for me, I always think about like, well, how when I appear before Christ, is he going to say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant," or is he going to say, "Well, Andrew, you did all right," but I mean, probably that. But my point is, or is he going to say, "You completely missed the mark," right? So there's this constant thing in my mind, like whether that's salutary or not is a different question. But I think that like what that means though with this is that there are other people like that too. They just don't know how to go about it. And again, when you scratch that surface and you start going in that direction, look, Christ had conflict. Like, read the Gospels. I mean, seriously, like he was dealing with institutional conflict his entire ministry during his whole ministry.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
positive in his private life, he probably had injustice in pay, all the things that regular people deal with, So like, I
Oh,
think
yeah.
that like, and so I think that like what confuses me to your point of well they're leaving anyway is why not scratch the surface? Just
Yeah.
do it. You have God behind. If you really believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and you really believe that this is the path to salvation, the like Vatican II says, the prime
Yeah.
path to salvation, well then just do it. What do you have to lose? We're all gonna die anyway. Like to me, it's a dumb bet. Like,
And
what are
it's
you betting on? Why are you betting on the world? You know it's finite. It's obvious. So why wouldn't you bet on that? That's the part that doesn't make sense to me. It's
especially
like
since it's more fun and more
exactly, it is more fun.
fulfilling. And
I
not only
completely agree
that,
with that.
you might take a hit at first and lose like 65% of your parishioners and only
Exactly.
35% remain. But that 35% is going to ignite a fire that's going to attract more people back
Exactly.
into that parish in the long run.
Exactly.
Now, come on, I think a lot of priests know this, but like I said, there are just so many factors working against us right now, and we're
Exactly.
so swimming upstream against the culture.
That
And
shows life.
a priest is just one person swimming against this tide,
Yep.
and we're almost asking priests in modern parishes to do the impossible in a lot of
Well,
ways.
I mean, I think here well, I think it is. it can be looked at as impossible. But again, just from my perspective of it is that like, look, I think if it's your like start small, like with anything. Like to your point, the mass. Just
Yeah.
go to the bishop, go to someone and say, whoever you have to, I don't know because I'm not a priest, but like go to someone and say, like if I was, in my job, I'd be like, hey, boss, I want to do X. Here's the reason I want to do X. Like, can we do a small investment in this? In fact, I did this at one of the jobs I was at. I I wanted to do something that was kind of innovative. And so my boss at the time, who I was kind of friends with, I went to him and said, hey, look, like this is the big kind of vision I have that's innovative, but like I understand that's a significant investment. So let's just do this small part of it and see how it goes. And then we can adjust as we go down the road, right? Like normal
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah.
And so that seems to me a pretty obvious thing to do. And then what happened was in this particular case is the little pilot proved itself and it ended up being this great project that helped a lot of people and so I think that's all they need. So I'd say if we take it all at once, yes, it's impossible. But if we broke it down into like, okay, let's just say just get one mass that's actually doing it right.
We're going to do one little mass, right?
Exactly.
Yes. Yes. Hmm.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Exactly.
One little mess, right? Hmm. Yes. Hmm. Yeah, we could do it. And
Right.
I remember that like 30 years ago now, that movie, maybe even longer, that movie came out based on a true story about the math teacher in an inner city school that wanted to prove that he could teach calculus to a bunch of poverty-stricken, kids from the hood.
No, I never
And
saw this
like,
one.
oh yeah, well, oh gosh, I can't think of the name of the movie now. It was based
Okay.
on a true story. And he
Yep.
got resistance, but he got them to do one thing well, calculus. And then they nailed their college entrance exams,
Yep.
or some kind of calculus major standardized test. And the people that were looking at were so dumbfounded, they accused him of and his students of cheating.
There you
So
go.
they made them take the test all over again, and they did even better the second time around,
Learn from
proving
the
that
mistakes. Nice.
and it was transformative to these kids' lives because they were shown their greatness. They
Yep.
were shown that their neighborhood was not their destiny, that
Yep.
they had greatness within them, and he called them up to greatness, and
Yep.
they achieved it. And
Yep.
we need to do likewise in our church,
Yep.
you know?
Well,
Uh,
and I also think the thing is too is when they let's hypothetical, we'll like go here. Let's say the priest does this. Well, not only is that going to be attractive to the people who want the Christ life, we'll call it, the people from the outside that we're all talking to, when I say, hey, come to this mass, and they see the sanctified beauty, they see that faith, that's an opportunity for them to be lit on fire to then, you see what I'm saying? Like it all
yeah.
feeds into everything. And I think, and again, so it's not just simply, like we're saying, it's not simply just for Catholics who still believe, it's also for those who don't believe who could come in based on creating the right environment, for them to be lit on fire too. And I just,
Yeah.
and again,
Yeah.
it just seems to me like it's, and I get like, and I think too, a lot of it is historic. Like, for example, like you'll have like, oh, well, this parish has always done this way for this many years and blah, blah. And it's like, I'm getting tired as a younger person of hearing that. It's like, listen, I understand it was done this way for X amount of years. I get it. But that doesn't mean it needs to be done that way forever. Like, like you see what I'm saying? Like, and if this is
Yeah.
a vibrant parish with life, circumstances may change that cause you to respond differently. It doesn't change who you are. It's you're responding to what's changed around you. You see what I'm saying? So I think that gets conflated sometimes, where it's like,
Oh,
oh,
it
that's
really does.
yeah,
It
yeah,
does. And I think that's a key element that you just identified there at the end, which is you've got to be able to identify how things have changed.
right, exactly.
And the parish has to evolve with how things have changed.
Yep.
Absolutely. But anyway, we've been going on now for about an hour and 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
So she would wrap it up soon. But are there any other thoughts, Andrew, that you
Andrew,
might
thoughts?
have? Andrew,
Um,
deep thoughts from Andrew Gniadek.
yeah, I like that. Deep
Deep
thoughts.
thoughts.
I mean, I think that like I, I think regardless of what the parish priests choose or the bishops choose or the hierarchy choose,
Yeah.
inevitably it's just going to keep going the direction it's going. Because if nothing changes, nothing changes, right? So not to be tautological, but like if if they don't do anything and it's still going in this direction, there's no motion that's going to push it in another direction, right? And now you could say God may
Yeah.
push it, but then that's doing exactly what we're saying, meaning Christ, that faith will set on fire to change the direction of things, which I hope it does. But if it doesn't, then again, it goes
Yeah.
back to how do we explain the church? How do we understand ourselves, i.e., what is the church in light of Poland? Communist Poland is a good example. And then how do we, in light of that, dealing with these structural debates about, which again, I think reduced to what is the Christ life? How do
Yes.
we respond to non-believers to tell them what the Christ life is? That's kind of how I'd,
And how everything is local.
yes,
I mean, it's boots on the ground. It's like,
exactly.
so I'm one of the things that strikes me over and over
Hmm.
and over again
Hmm.
is the abject failure. And once again, not to be tautological, as you pointed out, but the abject failure of bureaucratic solutions,
Yep,
a big picture solution. So, for example, my
exactly.
point is this: if you were to go to the average parishioner, if
Yep,
there is such a thing, in an average Catholic parish in the United States, if there is
yep.
such a thing, and I think it
Right,
probably is, a sociologist with
right.
some acumen in these regards could figure this out. And you
Yep,
were to ask them, what do you think of the synod on synodality?
yep.
They would probably say again, what? The synod on what?
Exactly.
Oh, there we had a meeting on meetings. It was in
Right.
Rome. It was a big meeting about having meetings, and we had it in Rome.
No,
And it's how the church needs to have more meetings.
I know.
And so, what do you think? Well, I had no idea it was even going on. Sorry.
Right.
Or to bring it back to the Eucharistic revival. How many average Catholics and average Jews say, "How's that Eucharistic revival doing for you in your personal life?" Say
Exactly.
what? What Eucharist? There's a Eucharistic revival. What are you talking about?
Right.
Because they don't they're not immersed in Catholic media all day long,
Exactly.
and so
Exactly.
what affects them are not these grand gestures on the part of the church. What
Yep.
affects them are boots on the ground, local initiatives. What is this priest in this parish doing? What is he
Yep.
like? What is he
Yep.
preaching? How present is he to his people? What is he doing? What is the faith life of this particular people like? To go back to what you said, what is my neighborhood? What is this community like? How has this parish changed over the years?
Yep.
That's where the rubber meets the road.
Absolutely. And I also think that what you just highlighted there is a point that's very important for me philosophically and personally, and ironically, you'll hear what I'm about to say is we've, and this is everywhere, so it's not just the institutional church. We've abstracted from the human person so much. And I think this is the door that John Paul II, the Vatican Council, Benedict, they were all knocking on
Yeah,
this door. We have abstracted from the human person so much that we can only think in these abstracted systems of change rather than saying the localized approach, like you're saying, like, okay, I know I want the faith to be more on fire. I know Father so and so at the parish over here would be so. I'm going to go talk to him about it and see what I can do here. Or I'm going to
yeah,
go talk to this person. In other words, it's all personal and it's personal and localized because persons are localized. And I just think
that's right.
you and you see it like look at not to bring up a huge topic, but AI like that is going to grow and grow and grow and be fed by this bureaucratic structure in our world to literally decide, hey, Larry, can you do X, Y, or Z today? Or I'm saying like that's where this is going. And I just think, and I'm not saying that in a conspiratorial sense. What I mean is that allows more bureaucratic, systematic, grand plan structuring that by nature is going to dehumanize people because they're not.
Exactly.
I mean, come on,
It,
it
it
just
bureaucratizes everything.
it
Let's have
bureaucratizes everything.
let's have a
Exactly.
parish. Let's have a parish wide meeting where a priest asks the question: um, Is it a sin to be stupid? Yeah. Well, yes, it is. Okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the cultivated stupidity of so many of us, myself included. Here's what's really bad about being stupid. Let's talk about stupid. Stupid is a stupid. Or here's another one. Let's talk as a parish about what it means to be an asshole. Okay. And let's try
Hmm.
not to be assholes. So
Hmm.
let's have a synod on assholishness. And let's hold this synod on stupidity, assholishness, indifference, and so on. Because now you're talking about what people experience on a daily,
Experience
right?
exactly.
Every asshole they encounter, every dumbass they encounter in their lives, every person who with the crushing indifference towards anything except themselves, all
Yep.
right, or their next car or whatever, that's where the rubber meets the road.
Yep.
And that's what we need. We need more synods on being stupid assholes than, than, than anything else. But anyway, I can say that on my podcast because it's mine, and I'll say whatever.
Exactly. You do what you want. This is your space. Yeah. No, I agree. And I think too that you'll see I would also, and I'll say one final thing on this is I'll say if once these changes start, what I think people will also see is you'll see things where I've noticed in my own life, like when as you become closer to Christ, you change, right? You become like you do things differently. You start to think differently. You look at things differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the converse can also happen, meaning someone else could you start to see where like maybe it's a friend and all of a sudden they're just not going in the right direction. That's that cost we're talking about earlier.
Yeah.
That's I think the struggle people have because then it begets, here we are again, to conflict, where it's looked at as like, well, we can't have conflict. So in order to, no, it's sometimes you have to stand your ground on what's right. And that's not being a idealist or using the word principles not in a dynamic way, using it in a static way. It's being a human person and living a life, and that life that they're proposing is contrary to the Christ life. So you just have to say, I can't live that life. Again, using the healthy example we talked about earlier, if someone says, hey, just go eat McDonald's with me every day, you'll be fine. No, I don't think so. You're going to have a health problem. And if
That's
you're
right.
starting to live a healthy life, you're not going to be eating as many McDonald's meals, right? So that's the conflict, right? So, but anyway,
And I like McDonald's, but I
I
agree
like
with you.
McDonald's too. McDonald's is just fine.
All right. I think, well, let's end on that. A happy
Let's end
note,
on that. Yeah,
a
that,
happy
that's
meal
great.
note. All right. Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. We covered everything from soup to nuts, and we have finally come up with a formula for fixing the church.
You're welcome, everyone. Yeah, exactly. Right.
Thank you, one and all, for joining us today. This was fun, and I'm sure I'll have Andrew back on again someday. So take care, everyone, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Larry.
Okay, you're welcome. Now I need to figure out how to shut this thing off. And okay, now I know. Here we go. Bye, everyone.